You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or their affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Good evening and welcome to the Paranormal Concept Show. My name is Kerry Greenaway and I know you're used to hearing the dulcet tones of Mr. Paul Rook, but he's decided to step out, shall we say, of this particular show. So I'm joined in the studio by a lovely friend of mine, Mr. Andy Mercer. Good evening, Andy. How are you?
Hello, Kerry. I'm not doing too bad at all. Things are pretty good.
Well, the last time we caught up together was at the Nameless Arte Conference, which was on the 16th of November, a couple of weeks ago now. And there was so much information and so much relevancy to the field that, the general paranormal field, that I think people don't really realise. And you had some absolutely amazing speakers at the conference there. And you was one of the organisers. We had you on before talking about it, but now it's done. How do you feel it went?
Oh, well, first of all, I'm quite relieved it is finished. It's quite a busy day, to say the least. A lot of organising, a lot of last-minute changes, unfortunately. As you know, we unfortunately lost a guest speaker at the last minute due to the weather. They literally couldn't get down from where they lived up in the Midlands because they were literally just watered in, if you like, waterlogged area, and the roads were pretty awful, so we had to have a last-minute rejig of everything. But yes, I think it went really well, actually. In fact, it probably went a little more smoothly than it would have done, considering the fact that we had a last-minute change, and it meant we had slightly longer breaks and a lot more time to set things up. So, yeah, it went probably better than I thought it was going to do. I have to say it was also busier than I thought it was going to be. We had an idea of ticket sales, and admittedly they hadn't been as good as the previous 2 years, which I think is partly due to the fact it was closer to Christmas, being early November. And also it was the week after the Witchfest conference in London, which is huge, and a lot of people go along to that. So I was really surprised, actually, that we had quite a few people play on the day, so numbers were higher than expected. So that was really good as well. But overall, yes, very happy with it. It took about 3 days to recover, I have to say, but otherwise it went really well, I thought.
It was. I was a person that came, an attendee, and I thoroughly enjoyed the day. It was absolutely brilliant, and I learnt so much stuff. Now, let's go through some of the speakers and some of the things we learnt, because there was a lot of focus on grimoires, wasn't there?
Well, we had two speakers in particular who were going to speak about that area of the occult, one of which is, very well known indeed, David Rankin, who's very much an old hand at speaking, has authored or co-authored more than 20 books on the topic. And the other one was my friend John Keiko James, who's not new to the field, but new to kind of more publicly talking about stuff. And his first book came out a couple of years back now, which was very good, and I was slightly involved in that one, and he's working on a new one now. And that was the topic really of his talk, was about grimoire, magic and women, which is an interesting area that hasn't been covered an awful lot, because you tend to think of grimoire, ceremonial magic, or what's known as high magic, as being magic of men, if you like, literally males, whereas things like lower magic we call witchcraft and that kind of thing is seen as more of a predominantly a female craft, shall we say. In actual fact, both cross over into both, but you get more predominancy of one in one and one in the other. But what's coming through with John's research, and others are working on similar areas, is that there are definitely women that became well educated, did get into practicing grimoire magic, and he was particularly talking about one initially one woman in particular, but then branched on to other people who found evidence showing that they were involved in that area.
Well, very much so. Now, John, you're talking about John. Now, he detailed the Rye Witch trials, didn't he? Which it is out there. You can find it if you go out on the internet to find it. But what's actually come out is he's transcribing the actual trial documents, isn't he? That's what he's trying to do. Incredibly difficult task, I would like to say. They're not easy to read. In fact, one document he was saying to me afterwards was he'd even given it to a professional calligrapher to try to translate, and even that person was unable to do so because the writing is so hard to decipher, and John's no stranger to translation himself. So he's ploughing through this. But this particular witch trial actually details a book that was used by Anna Taylor and Anna Bennett within their workings, and the crossover between the scientific medical side of things and witchcraft, which I found absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, those are fields that would not have been separated the way they are today. We often think of astrology and astronomy, for example, being two very different interests, but astronomy came from astrology. And certainly in those times, there was no real differentiation between the two. What's interesting in saying about the manuscripts, I think it's not so much translation as transliteration, because they're in English, believe it or not, but it's very archaic English and very unusual to our eyes handwriting. I mean, I've had some experience of this myself, working with documents from a similar age, that of Dr. John Dee, I've spoken of many times. I have copies of his original handwritten diaries, and although he was very well educated and had reasonably good handwriting, they're hard to read in places as well. Often he was writing very fast, but they're also difficult to follow, and they are in good English. So a lot of these documents are written in less than good English, shall we say, and often written quite quickly, and they are very hard to read, even though they're actually in our language. The only time other languages tend to be used in these sort of documents would have been Latin. But again, it's not incredibly hard to read Latin. It takes training, obviously, but it's not like it's reading sort of hieroglyphs or something like that. But because you're talking about documents that are hundreds of years old with non-standard English is obviously the other thing as well. Many of these English writing in those days wasn't as standard in terms of its spelling as it is today, and you could find the same word spelled differently as the documents went along. So yeah, they are incredibly hard to follow, even though they're actually in our own language. But they are, I mean, I've seen a few bits and pieces myself. They're actually fascinating. There is real nuggets of information hiding in those documents.
And this is something that John is actually trying to do, is actually look at these documents and find out all those like tidbits of information, like you say. And as I say, it does detail a book, which you said right at the head of the show, is an unusual viewpoint of our perception of that time with witchcraft and working. It's very much the women are folk magic almost, they're just, building up potions and lotions in their cauldron, and it's very, you've got that image of not educated women, and men are viewed as more, when you think of going back in that time frame, you think of John Dee and you think of all the books he's got and the learning that he's got and stuff like that. But there was a survey done at the time John was talking about, saying that there's a survey of just London alone, 20,000 women in London were literate. They could read and write, which is much higher percentage than you would imagine, isn't it? So, and okay, that number lessens as you get into the outer lying villages and stuff, but there were a higher percentage of women than is perceived from our knowledge of history.
Yeah, absolutely. That was very much the point that comes across. That I think one of the things I'd say is we're more talking about the difference between kind of classical education and actual education. These women we're talking about might have been gone to the universities or colleges that existed at the time, but they were certainly educated in the ways of the world by sort of family and parents. So the ability to read was a little perhaps more widespread than we'd have thought, but it was fairly basic reading ability, whereas a lot of these old documents that we're talking about for higher magic are often again written in Latin, or they would be written mainly in Latin, or other languages which you would need a modicum of education to have any chance of reading at all, which is what made that kind of split occur between the two. But certainly again, I know from my own researches, but just generally, there are a lot more men involved in folk magic than perhaps we might have realised, and a lot more women were definitely involved in higher magic. I mean, we use terms high and low magic. That's not to say one's better than the other. It's just that's just the terms that have been developed. Some would say high magic tends to be more cerebral, more sort of brain involved, and sort of low magic is more practical, out in the landscape doing stuff. But as we know from sort of the talk later on, that you still practice high magic out in the landscape if you want to. You don't have to be at home. In fact, as one of the other speakers, Dave Rankin, was saying, you'd often find places outside that people would work at a particular area they preferred to work in, and it would still be the quote high magic that was being carried out there, as well as more sort of low sort of pagan-y, not pagan's really the wrong word, more sort of folk magic, as you said, would be also perhaps done indoors as well, with the cauldron sort of working away in secret in your little hut. So the two kind of could almost swap places compared to how we would imagine them to be carried out and practiced.
Most definitely. And this is something that really was prevalent in the talks that we heard. Now, can you detail the word grimoires?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we hear that word, and a lot of people imagine it to be like a book of spells, like I suppose these days people would talk book of shadows and stuff like that. Can you explain what a grimoire is? What the difference is, actually?
Sure, yeah. I mean, first and foremost, the term itself is a bit of a mystery. It's believed to come from the French for grimoire, but no one really knows where the term comes along. It's probably a kind of amalgamation of different terms kind of linked in together. But, I mean, essentially, grimoire is a book of spells. What is called a grimoire in sort of high magic, sort of traditional ceremonial magic, and a book of spells, a book of shadows is the kind of thing you might talk about in modern Wicca. They're essentially the same thing. I mean, sort of old pagan witches wouldn't necessarily have had written books of spells. They often did have them memorized. They'd know them off by heart. Or if they did, they'd be kind of small little books of sort of handwritten stuff. Whereas even in the late Middle Ages, some grimoires were actually printed. I mean, obviously, as printing became more popular in the 1700s, there were a lot more of them being printed. In fact, as one of the speakers said, the prevalence, they were all over the place because it was very easy and cheap to print these things. But a grimoire itself is basically an instruction book of how to practice certain forms of magic, how to cast particular spells, and they'd often involve things like sigils, magical signs which you'd carve or paint or draw on various items or on the floor, if you like, you work in that way, and then giving the words to say incantation to be spoken aloud or chanted or even sung sometimes in order to create the effect you're looking for, whether it's to summon something to you or to make something happen, or if you want to astrally project or travel to certain realms, if you like, this is what you do. So essentially the two aren't that dissimilar in terms of what they contain, but the different kind of magic you find in these different sorts of books of shadows and spells and grimoires, etc., would vary only in terms of what the content was, what they were designed to do. Would probably be very similar. I mean, a lot of the sort of folk magic stuff that gets written down again by hand, which we do have documentation of, is those kind of landscape spells, trying to make the cows produce more milk or better growing your crops. But also you have things that were like cursing somebody who'd done you wrong, or to find a thief, or a common one was to find one's love. But again, they often involved sometimes some sigils, some symbols that were drawn, but were often not just in forms of words, objects you'd find you'd need to use, and words you'd say over those natural objects. Whereas a grimoire, you tend to do a lot more drawing. I feel like there's a bit more art involved. But to see some of the actual genuine documents, you can see the art wasn't that great either. They couldn't draw the circles or like fake sort of squiggles and lines and shapes. But again, it's one of those questions that has come up in the past, is where do these sigil images come from? And that in itself isn't entirely clear. They sort of popped up again, sort of Middle Ages, started to be added to sort of spell books and grimoires of magic. And whereas earlier ones, like books like the Testament of Solomon, which knows about the 3rd century AD, there's just words. There's no imagery, there's no sigils or magic of that kind in there at all. It is just incantations. So it's an interesting idea that this art part became part of the drawing of your magical spell, etc. It's something that kind of got introduced again in the Middle Ages without any real obvious reason as to why they popped in or decided to appear. But I mean, our own Nameless Art symbol we use, it comes from a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft, which effectively is about sort of folk magic, etc. But it also talks about the fact that some of these manuscripts have got out into the world, if you like, into sort of rural cultures, rural societies, and they have drawn upon this because those images are both quite sigil-like, and they're actually from sort of folk magic. So there was definitely a crossover between the two as well. So the short answer is that it's just a different name for essentially the same kind of text, to be honest with you. It's someone's collection of spells.
Does Necromica come under that banner too?
I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, it was just one of the words that John used, the Necromica.
Necromica? I must admit I'm not familiar with it. You don't mean Necronomicon, do you?
Yeah.
You mean the Necronomicon?
Necromica? Or Necromicon? Maybe I wrote it down wrong. It's quite possible.
I I wouldn't have thought John would have mentioned the Necronomicon, because it's a fictional book of ghastly black magic, evil, sort of monster, demon summoning rubbish that's actually created by H.P. Lovecraft for the Cthulhu mythos. That's the Necronomicon. That's the one I know of for definite, and it isn't a real. Well, it's a real book, but it's a modern invention that's created for a novel, a series of books by H.P. Lovecraft. But no, I'm not specifically sure about the one you're referring to, if that's not what he meant. So I don't know.
Well, that's the word I wrote down, but I know it from The Evil Dead, because they read from that to raise people from the dead.
That is the Necronomicon. That is H.P. Lovecraft's invention. It's one of those ones. It's very much got a life of its own, partly to do with a chap called Kenneth Grant, who kind of put forward, I mean, others had also done it, but he was probably best known for it, this idea that H.P. Lovecraft was a fictional writer from the 1920s in America. He wrote a series of short stories, which stories themselves aren't that great, to be honest with you. They're not that brilliantly well written, but what they contain is what's known as a Cthulhu mythos, which is a whole host of demonic entities that come from other realms that are attempting to take over our reality. And the chief one is Cthulhu. Now, the interesting thing is the ideas are vaguely based and sort of lean towards sort of Babylonian mythology and Sumerian. He's trying to give the kind of impression that that's where they've come from. But the names, they are made up. The Necronomicon itself is a made-up book. And again, as you said, it features in The Evil Dead. People talk often from The Evil Dead. But it's not really, in the sense it doesn't have any historical validity to it. There's no mention of it before the 1920s when Lovecraft started writing about it as a plot device, something you introduce in the storyline to move the story along. But what people like Grant have suggested is that this somehow was tapping into some kind of arcane knowledge that really did exist, as if he somehow brought it down from the ether into the real world. Now, the trouble is you can argue that about anything, any of these kinds of texts. There's no real history to it, because it's actually an astral text that someone's now finally, for the first time in several thousand generations, actually written it down. But you can say that about anything. That's the trouble with that. But the Necronomicon itself, there is no real even suggestion of its existence before H.P. Lovecraft wrote his stories. So that kind of gives it a bit of a problem as being as historically valid as the other grimoires, which we talked about on the day, things like the Book of Solomon, the Goetia, the Gemeton, all those ones that have a definite real history, which is of hundreds of years, not just a few decades, which is obviously in the 1920s is only a few decades ago. Very much so.
Now, there is a huge history of grimoires, as David talked about. It goes back a lot further than I anticipated, actually, this availability. How common are they to get hold of?
Well, today, very, very easy. Could be easier. Amazon. Shops in London, I mean, there being modern versions of modern printings are coming out all the time. There are dozens and dozens. I mean, the most famous one in particular really is the Key of Solomon. And David Rankin, along with Dr. Stephen Skinner, wrote the veritable Key of Solomon, which contains extracts from 32 different versions of it. They've probably the most complete collection has been brought together ever. And it's available via Amazon or via his own publishing house, Stephen Skinner's own publishing house. So today, they're relatively easy to get hold of. Going back in time, the further back you go, of course, the harder they get to get hold of. They would have been incredibly rare up until fairly recently, because, of course, they would be seen as diabolical books of dark magic. And even though the Key of Solomon is not really dealing with the evil spirits at all, it's more dealing with angels, it's still seen as being, you're meddling with God's power, etc. You're damned, you're risking your life and limb and soul, even in having these things in your house. That was, until relatively recent, that was very much the attitude. But modern times now, it's quite easy to get them sort of quite cheaply in paperback, from not necessarily a local bookshop, because most of them don't have that sort of thing, but certainly things like eBay, Amazon, EBE Books, all those kind of places, you can easily buy them yourself. It's knowing what you've got and what's real and what's not real, if you like. A good example.
Yeah, I was going to say, how can you tell?
Well, history. Usually you can track these things down historically. As I say, David Rankin and Stephen Skinner's series of books they worked on together called the Sorcerers of Magic are brilliant, because they do exactly that. They do trace the real history. A simple example is a book that came out in the 1950s. It's off the top of my head, so I might get the date slightly wrong, of magic called the Let me just go and grab it. Pause for a second.
It's just going to his library, and trust me, when I say this man has got a library, it's a real library. He's got a study that everybody would dream of having, with an absolute plethora of books in it. Did you grab it? He's probably just leaned back and grabbed it, like you see in the movies.
Published in the 1960s was The Secret Grimoire of Turiel. Okay, first appeared in 1960. Now, it was always thought that this was a modern invention, invented probably in the 1960s. There's a story in it, in the introduction, about how the book first came to the hands of Marius Malicus, who published it. He claims that around about 1910, it was a little story. He was a sailor on the USS Ivone and went to a Portuguese port in East Africa, blah, 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 and was given this manuscript and he wrote about this in the 1950s. And the book was supposed to have been published originally in 1518, and this edition was from 1927. Now, it was thought to be nonsense. It was maybe kind of made up a bit. Perhaps it was going back to the turn of the century, but no earlier than that. Fairly recently, the book's handwritten by a chap called Frederick Hockley, who used to copy manuscripts of magic from places like the British Library and other places they were stored. He'd take them out, hand copy them, for himself and for friends, and friends would also borrow his copies and handwrite them out themselves. No printing involved, just done by hand, would circulate around their group in the sort of early to mid-1800s. And one of the manuscripts he had was his Book of Magic Spells. And he'd written it out. It was copied from a manuscript that probably went back to the 1700s or 1600s. And when it was first published, which was only about 10 years ago, it came out in publication, it was basically the same material as The Secret Grimoire of Turiel. So it proved absolutely this book was much older than was actually thought. So it was that's kind of backdate it or apply a dating period of this, taking it back to at least the 1700s, much older than we actually thought it was. So that's what can happen sometimes. Things that you think are modern nonsense that are made up, that aren't particularly real or have any real history to them, turn out to be actually genuinely older. But what's in this book is a book of Olympic spirits, Olympic magic, Greeks, and it fits in with kind of what you'd expect to find from a book from that kind of period. So whoever had written it looked like they'd done really good research and invented this thing. They hadn't. It was a real book. It actually had real history to it. So that was fascinating. And that's one of the things that's been happening the last sort of 10, 15 years or so, is a lot of versions have been available in print since sort of the 1800s and early 20th century. They are okay, but they often have errors of transcription in them and are incredibly well written. And because they've been copied from copies of copies. So you get mistranslations, and often again it's taken from sort of Greek or Latin, and things get lost. But what this Frederick Hockley chap was doing, and friends of his were doing, was actually, to say, handwriting, copying original manuscripts from much earlier periods in time. So they were much more like the original thing. But they'd sit tucked away in dusty libraries for decades, centuries. I mean, it was the mid to late 1800s these were being done. And they were kind of almost found, if you like, or at least there were people began to realise places like the Wellcome Trust in London held a few of his copies of his books. There was a big library in America that's got a few of his books that made their way over there but haven't been sold at auctions and things like that. So they've gone into private collections. But they started to emerge as being published, and the first to really bring them up was a company called Titan Press in the early 2000s, started publishing transcriptions and then facsimiles of Hockley's handwritten manuscripts, and they've become really quite popular. In fact, there's a few other publishers who are involved in publishing Hockley's original handwritten, or people who Hockley knew who've copied his work, and then they're now being published. So there's a dissemination of much more going back to the proper source material than a lot of the modern reprints that you get available now. For example, the most popular one that you can buy easily is MacGregor Mathers' version of the Key of Solomon. Now, Samuel MacGregor Mathers is one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, which is a whole other story, but he was publishing stuff in the 1800s and early 1900s that he was copying from libraries in France. But his translation style was a bit slapdash, a bit messy. His Key of Solomon, as David mentioned, which I knew, but is made up of at least 4 different manuscripts, which he took bits of one and bits of another one that have different ideas in them, different ways they've been written out, and just sort of mashed them all together, like a mash-up mix, if you like, of several songs put together, which inevitably carries some of the errors made in the original translation work. And what Hockley's have got is the originals copied letter by letter, word by word from documents of the 1700s. So they are much truer to the original source material, which is why they're so important and they're being brought out. And in fact, there's a new one coming out literally at any time, which I've been involved in, which is one reason why I'm talking about it. I've actually written a piece on Hockley himself in the introduction to this version that my publisher, my old publisher, who's bringing out literally the next couple of weeks. But the point is, there are a lot of these are traceable, going back hundreds of years. But one particular story I'd like to briefly mention, which is really important, there's always been a text floating around called the Hydromantia, which again was mentioned at the conference, which has always had for a long time been thought would be nothing more than kind of water spell magic that came from Greek times. But another edition of it, if you like, was discovered relatively recently in a church in Greece, where the church goers were using old books, which they thought were of no real interest or value, as resting stools, which you sort of kneel on. You go into church sometimes, you see a little cushion thing on the seat in front, which you use to kneel on if you're saying prayers. But they were using old books. And it turned out one of them was an old version of Hydromantia, but it was the complete Hydromantia. And it turned out, most likely, that the Book of Solomon, or Key of Solomon mentioned before, was taken from the Hydromantia. So this was actually a really important book. It was a really important find. It sat in that church for centuries. No one really noticed. No one really cared. But yeah, there it is. It's a very early edition of it, showing that this is probably the Hydromantia is probably the source of a lot of the what we call the Solomonic grimoires, which treats King Solomon as being like the most important dude, the one who did lots of magic. Sorry, my voice keeps going. So discovering that, again, relatively recently, it was really important. I mean, there probably are grimoires out there that we've never seen, that have never been published before, yet probably contain important information, which we haven't as yet had access to.
Wow, that's just mind-blowing, really, isn't it, when you think about it?
I hope our listeners are keeping up. I do apologise if you're not.
It is quite involved and a lot more in depth than people, I think, sometimes realise when you're looking at today's modern witchcraft movement or the pagan movement, or, you know, you talk about those, you know, pagan shops that have popped up. But when you actually start looking at these things, they're a lot more involved than people think. And also, the other thing that came through from the conference was the person doing the spell, as it were, was used as a secondary person as the seer kind of person. So they weren't actually the ones receiving the message. They would use another person, and the person in mind, and I know you're an authority on this person, was John Dee and Kelly, wasn't it?
Yes.
So John Dee would do the magical working, and Kelly would be the one who would actually be receiving the messages, I suppose you would call it.
Essentially, yes. I mean, that was the idea that often, as David mentioned in his talk, a lot of the grimoire magic was actually carried out with a group of people working together rather than individuals. Now, he said that it tends to work best that way. That may be the case, but certainly my own experience has always been working alone. I know many people tend to prefer to work alone rather than work in groups. So it does certainly work that way. But again, one of the problems you'd have to overcome is things like that. If things are happening and you're in the middle of it all, it's hard to then sort of pause, say, hold on a minute, guys, I need to write down what's happening here, you know. So often you'd need someone else who would be the observer, at least one other person who was not necessarily in the circle, if you like, or doing part of the work, was observing what was happening, which, you know, was necessary and important because you know you're going to remember all that's going on around you. But one of the things, of course, modern technology has meant that you can do that now. You just record it, you know, have a camcorder recording or just audio, as I tend to prefer. When I was certainly working, even back in the earlier times, when I was working on my book on Liber Coronzon, which is on Enochian magic, we were just talking about, I had an old-fashioned cassette tape recorder. You know, just press the two buttons that play and record together and just record whatever the hell I was seeing and then transcribe it later on rather than just trying to remember it. So technology has made that part of the task much more easier, and therefore it is easier, or at least certainly possible, that you can work alone now. But as we've talked before, I've always been of the mind I prefer to work with a medium, not a person medium, but an object thing medium, i.e. using what we call dark mirror, which of course you know about in one of your shows, but the black mirror which you look into, or a crystal ball, which again comes from John Dee's work, rather than bringing something actually into the room with you, which doesn't really happen in any way. Others would say yeah, it does, but then you'll put yourself in a lot more risk and danger than you would otherwise be. So it's better not to do that, to try and use something. You know, it's like rather than going to see the theatre play of something, watching the film of it. You still get the same information coming across, but they're not literally in the room with you.
Well, actually, like you said, David Rankin used an absolutely fantastic analogy for that, didn't he? Which was, if you can't do a lot underwater, you have only got so much breath, and spirit are crossing a realm. So to help them, you use a medium for them to use it. Yes. We're talking, like you say, a spirit or a scrying glass or a bowl of water or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
absolutely.
it helps them cross through rather than coming through into air effectively. It was the analogy he used that explained that perfectly.
Absolutely. When we're not dealing with... So, just 2 seconds, I just need a cough.
I wonder if it's because the spirits don't want us talking about this subject as to why Andy's got a cough tonight. But it is something, and we talk about using tools in this kind of work, and crystals are not new, scrying glasses are not new. You're back with me.
I've actually been talking as I unmuted it by mistake. I thought I kicked it back into life, but obviously I hadn't caught the button. No, this throat's been bugging me the last couple of days. I mean, I may have hit a very mild cold, nothing too bad, but it's been bugging me for a little bit. But yes, I mean, that's it. Because you're not dealing with physical corporeal beings, they're not real physical beings. I don't think they are. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 odd years, and I don't believe they are. I can understand why people think they're dealing with real physical beings in front of them. I can certainly understand why you think that, but I don't believe we are. But I find it better to kind of communicate by going to where they might be existing in whatever sort of level of reality, rather than, as you say, forcing you to breathe underwater. It's not pleasant at the best of times, and being summoned and forced to appear before somebody is like, being arrested, being carted off before the judge. It's like, no thanks, oh, you want to come and talk to me, you come to my place, you come to me. Especially if you want my help, you definitely come to speak to me in my realm.
Most definitely. Now, we're talking about spiritual tools, and this comes on to Martin Duffy's talk. He was looking at the cauldron. Now, what a fascinating talk he did on the cauldron, didn't he? And it got a lot of people's interest because it got quite sexual at times. The symbology of the cauldron and the sword was really quite sexual at times. But we talk about spiritual tools. Now, the cauldron linked with the woman, obviously. And that actually, he put it in... He makes it very simple. I love the talk he did a couple of years ago on poppets or dolls. People might recognise them as like voodoo dolls, but they're actually called poppets, and they're an old English tradition of magical workings, charms. But this time he was talking about the cauldron and the representation of it within the magical working. Can you explain us, tell our listeners a little bit more about that?
Well, the cauldron itself, it is your mixing pot. It is the thing that brings not just the physical ingredients together, but also the energies together. The idea of making too sexual here, we're talking about, it's almost like a womb. It's where these things are formed out of the material that's fed into them in the same kind of way. Obviously, what you eat goes into building the baby when you're pregnant. So that's the idea. But it also becomes a way of focusing your work as well. You've got a thing in front of you that is alive in a sense. If it's heated up, the liquids are moving, there's sound, the bubbling, etc. It all gives you something to focus upon as well. And it's that transformational process of applying heat to anything. I mean, for me, it's a little bit like alchemical work. You're dealing with bringing energies together to create something out of those energies. But it's even like, it's like cooking food almost. There's a magical process there because you're transforming food. You're transforming raw material into something else, often from stuff that will be inedible to edible. So you're transforming stuff there. So for me, that's how I've always seen the idea of the cauldron. It's not something I've personally ever worked with, but it is that kind of bringing elements together to generate and create, to, what's the word I'm looking for? It's gestate, basically, to create what you want to achieve with that. So, yeah.
Martin was actually talking about, like you talked about, the transformation of energy and melding those energies and bringing actually all the energy signatures together through the use of all of the elements through the cauldron too. Like you've got fire, water, air and spirit, all of those together, earth as well, obviously, with all the ingredients going into it. And it's that melding of energy and intention that you're putting into it that creates that. And you talked about gestation, which is actually what the cauldron represents. It represents the female womb, and the sword obviously represents the masculine area. And I'm very uncomfortable. And he talked about baptism of objects within the cauldron as well. Found that bit fascinating, because I'd never seen it like that before. I was like, oh gosh, yeah. But when it's put out in a talk of somebody who's researched it and knows all the different things to do with, that particular object of use, it was absolutely fascinating listening to that, and how he talked about the feminine and the masculine and the stirring with the sword, and it was just. And then the old, you're cooking up a storm. All of these things come from this cauldron and this way of working with it.
Absolutely, and it is interesting. That's one of the big crossovers between the two talks, was the idea of the sword, and that played an important role in both the sort of ceremonial magic as well as what Martin was talking about. So it is those tools of what you're working with, even if you're dealing with a different area of magic or different forms of magic, often cross over. So I've never used a sort of core anything I've done, but the whole gestation of creating stuff, again, that comes into the alchemy side of things as well, which also plays a part. So yeah.
Very much so. Now, he also we're talking about the difference between male and female working, and he says that generally men are viewed with command and intellect, which is obviously the sword, and then the female is attraction and relationship, and how the difference in those ways of working are actually incensed together by using these magical tools in producing the intention and the work that's being put out there in the form that you're producing and gestating. It's definitely a great word, that word. Yes. into the cauldron. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Richard. Phallus, that's the word I was searching for there. That's the better word.
Safer with. It's more comfortable, I think.
If anybody knows me, I'm very uncomfortable talking about those sort of things on the radio. And the men love putting it in front of me, particularly when we talk about this sort of
literally,
things.
I hope. On a radio show.
And this is why we don't talk about those kind of spirits on any of the shows, because I'm too uncomfortable about it all. I think I've done it once. Now, he was also talking about the cauldron, which were spirit houses, which again, this is a new concept to me. Some places would have like a little cauldron, and they'd make it like really attractive to the spirits, so not used in magical work, but almost like a little spirit house for them, where they can live, because they wanted the attraction of spirits into their house and their room. Nice spirits that they can work with. And that was just fascinating. We started talking about some of the work and some of the cauldron and objects that you found at Bosworth Witchcraft Museum.
Boscastle, yes.
Yes, sorry, I always get that one.
Incredible collection they have. I mean, I've actually got a little mini cauldron like what you just described. It's not designed for use in terms of cooking anything in it or heat it up. It'll probably melt. Well, it's brass, it'd be okay, but it's not designed for that. But it is that it's got things in it for that kind of purpose as well. It's an attractor, if you like. But yeah, it's almost like you have these kind of things to attract mice. This bowl, you trap them in, they fall in, they can't get out of it. It's almost like that. The cauldron kind of holds things in that kind of way. But yeah, I've got one of those little guys sitting on my shelf, yes.
And sometimes they'd place a silver coin inside, which makes it even more attractive. It's like the reflection of a moon.
Absolutely. Although you have to be very, very careful what you get into them, as John had spoken before on a radio show, but David Rankin also mentioned people think like fairies, trying to track those in. The fae, no, you don't want those around. They're not nice at all. They really are troublesome, to say the least. And as he said himself, his own experiences suggest, no, you don't want to deal with those guys. But yet we have this idea of sort of little Tinkerbell, that kind of thing. But that's a world away. That's pure Disney, folks, I'm afraid, compared to the reality of what they actually can be like.
Well, when we spoke to Neil Norman, was it? We spoke about the fairy realm, didn't we?
Mark Norman, yeah.
Mark Norman, sorry. And he was talking about that and how what they believed fairies are to what we now think of fairies
Yes.
is a world away, and it is not something to be trifled with or taken lightly.
They are troublesome, to say the least. They are tricksy, is the word it comes from. That's the connotation of the fairy, that kind of, play tricks on you and trap you and get you doing things you don't want to be doing, that kind of thing. Yeah, they're not to be dealt with, not to be treated lightly. So don't try and trap me in your bowl, folks. It's not a good idea.
No, those are not the ones you want to be attracting inside your cauldron, your house cauldron, your spirit house. And I found that whole thing, I had a thought actually while he was talking about spirit houses. Now, these days in modern paranormal world, the idea that something is attached to an object is very prevalent. It's crazy. And it's not just dolls and stuff these days, but it's like every object that you can think of. But I was thinking, while he was doing his talk, I was thinking, back in the day, when people were working very much in this way, in a completely different way to how we work now, they were doing this sort of thing, attracting a spirit to live in this little spirit house in the home. It's just an evolution, isn't it, then, of thought?
In a sense, but you wouldn't necessarily speak of these things possessing objects as if they're controlled and trapped in the object. Attracted to, yes, certainly. Make use of, connecting to, yes. I mean, I suppose the only kind of parallel you can have with genuine phenomena of things like the haunted dolls are things like puppets, which, as mentioned before by Martin in his talk before, they are a British thing. The idea of voodoo dolls is complete nonsense, totally fake, made up by British Christians going over trying to demonise literally the indigenous faith and bringing the idea of the voodoo doll could be cursed, etc. It was just taken purely out of British folklore. But those, again, are not necessarily possessed by anything. They're used as a way of attacking or getting at somebody, i.e. sticking pins in the puppet to make the person be hurt. It's building a connection to them. It isn't that they are possessed or spookily controlling those things. I mean, one of my personal bugbears is the idea of the Dybbuk box.
Glad you mentioned that.
Oh, yes, complete nonsense, made up modern rubbish. It was invented by someone basically as a story, which then became a film. There's been a number of films now, but their prevalency is all over the place, all over the internet, with paranormal investigators buying Dybbuk boxes and saying they're haunted and evil spirits in them. They don't exist. There's no such thing as a Dybbuk box. A Dybbuk, yes, certainly goes back to medieval Judaism as a particular form of ghostly spirit that could possess the living to try and finish a job that hadn't been done. I don't mean like a job like building a house, but a task that hadn't been completed in life, and it could be a positive one or a negative one. They are not necessarily evil or good. They're just possessing spirits that take over a person for a time to do what they want, and then they let go. Sometimes a Dybbuk spirit can be very positive energy, and the person inhabited by it doesn't want them to go because it's actually really useful having them around. But it's very specific and unique to Judaism. It's not something you find in Christianity. But yeah, the Dybbuk boxes are all over the place, and they just don't exist. They really are a modern invention that's now grabbed people's imagination and got run mad with them. It's like the idea of the haunted doll. It doesn't exist before the days of Annabelle. Suddenly this Annabelle thing crops up thanks to the Warrens, and then everyone's got a haunted doll doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. It's just following film trends. It's basically viral advertising working brilliantly.
Wow. It means the one I bought on eBay is not real then, right?
Unless you want it to be. Now remember, I'm serious here. Unless you want it to be, because remember, a lot of magic does involve will and intent, and if you're deliberately trying to create something into an energy and put it into something, potentially it can do something. It's not saying it's impossible, but it's not historic. It's not a genuine thing that exists unless you've created it yourself. And it does happen. We've talked before about things like tulpas, which are these spirit energies that you're generating. We know about things like the Philip experiment that shows these things can happen. But what you're actually dealing with and what you think you're dealing with can be quite different. And that's the essentially the point.
Very much so. It's all about intention.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing that was brought up in Martin's talk was the circle, which links back to the cauldron. Obviously, that's a circle.
Yeah.
And he was saying that it's no liminal points. Now, we talk about a liminal point as a point of crossing, don't we?
Yes, that's where the term comes from, certainly.
Mm-hmm. And he was saying that that's why we work in a circle, because it has no liminal points. So you've got the most control and protection within a circle.
yes. There's no obvious escape points. You can argue that if you're in something that's square, there are corners in which things can seep through a corner, but a circle, which is why it's prevalent again in sort of folk magic as well as ceremonial magic. The circle that you work within is an important feature. It's because there is no point of escape. It's continual. It's a circular area that's covered, whereas of course as a square or box, there are things about certain magic creatures that can come through the corner of a room. They can get through where the points meet, and that kind of thing can happen. With a circle, you can't do that. So that's why it tends to be an important element of most forms of magic, most uses of magic, you're certain.
And one other point that Martin brought up, which again I don't think a lot of people realise, and I love the fact that when you was at the conference, you're learning about the origins, what they mean. People go, oh, I've got my cauldron, but why have you got your cauldron? Do you know the symbology behind it? Do you understand why we use a sword? We see a lot of modern day witches have an altar with all these tools on it, but they don't know, do they?
Yeah, exactly. That's it. They see, I need to get X, Y, Z, A, B, C, get this thing, that thing, and this thing. Yeah, get them if you want, but do you know why you're getting them? No, maybe not so sure. Read it somewhere. I need to have these things, but yes, that is often the thing. Is it's nice to know why you're doing what you're doing. And as mentioned, certainly again going back to David's talk, the sword is one of the most important things you use. But because it's big and not easy to get hold of, people tend to not bother with swords. Might have a little knife, but the sword plays an important role because it's the thing that can cut through the air. Now, often we talk about these things can be formed of air or smoke or mist, and if you can slice through it with a sword, you break the connection. You're not literally cutting the air up, but you are causing a disturbance. So that's why it plays an important part. But because it's a large object, people often tend not to bother with things like having an actual sword. But it's the one thing, almost the most common thing you hear being referred to in magic is having a magical sword. You have the four elements, the articles that go with that, the cup. You have a disc, which is can be a pentagram. Your wand, which is something you'd use, but that's an air thing. A dagger is often used for cutting through the air, fire as well. So the wand's fire, air, dagger. But also the sword plays an important part, and often that's missed off as well. So, and I think it's one of the ones that does cross over, because you draw the circle with the blade of your sword as well.
Exactly, and it's those things that are really important to know the origins, to know why you're doing something. You're setting yourself out to do a ritual or an intention ritual, and you've got all these tools, but you've got to understand what their purpose is, not just use them because it looks good, because you've got to understand it from really understand what it is you're doing. Because if you are conjuring up an entity or trying to conjure up an entity, then you've got to have control of that, haven't you?
Well, that's the risk you take, because we've talked about this before. My personal views that these things are, you deal also with something in equal measure that's within you. So if it's almost like, do you really want to sit down and operate on your hand without really knowing exactly what you're doing? There is that to it as well. If you're going to start cutting bits of your fingers for whatever reason, you're going to remove that splinter, you want to make sure you know what you're doing. You don't want to just sort of start willy-nilly, oh, well, that looks like I'm supposed to do that. I'll just stick it in there and see what happens. That can be quite painful. Because you're involving elements of yourself, that can be the potential risk that people find. And, of course, then your belief systems come involved. If you believe something's going to happen and you try and make it happen and you don't do it right, you think, well, have I just done something wrong, or is something awful going to happen? Generally, in my experience, nothing happens. If you do it wrong, nothing tends to happen. It's a bit like I've said to you before, picking up your phone and dialing a friend but missing off a number. It just doesn't work. You're not going to get through to anybody. That tends to be what happens when you don't do it properly, because you miss something out. That said, again, through experimentation, I know you can limit down what you actually do by leaving bits out and seeing if it still works. I don't follow the full process of a knock-in invocation anymore, because I know the way I've tailored it for my way of working, it still works for me. But that's me. Somebody else might try the same way I use and find it doesn't work. I know from my book, Liber Corontum, people find it does work. I don't know any detail. People have told me they've tried what I've said and they found it works. So I know you can limit it down to a degree, but you have to know what you're doing to begin with to know what you can potentially leave out, or you can reduce in the involving of. So yeah, you need to know what you're doing.
Well, one thing came through. We're going to. I will go back to George in a moment, but I want to go on to David. He talked about the history development of grimoire magic, and the bibliography of it was absolutely fascinating to me. There was a hell of a lot more books than I anticipated knowing. I didn't know about half of them. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And he is an actual occultist. He actually works in this way. He's done this, hasn't he? Many, many times.
Oh, yeah.
And somebody in the audience asked him, does it work? I've asked you that question before, haven't I? You know, does it work? And he said, he was up talking, and he said, well, put it this way. He said, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, depending on many, many factors. He said, but you've got to keep trying. It's practice and getting it right, like you just said. He said, put it this way. He goes, I was looking for a manuscript. He said, and I'd gone to a particular shop. He said, and I'd scoured, it was a specialist shop, I would like to add. He'd scoured the bookshelves and couldn't find this manuscript he was after, and did a ritual to try to find where he could get this manuscript. And he got told to go back to the shop, and he was thinking, don't be ridiculous, I scoured that book. And they told him exactly where to look, and he did. He went back to the shop, he looked, and the manuscript he needed was there. Mm-hmm. He said, so when I start looking at stuff like that, he said, I can honestly say, for me, it works.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a library rather than a shop, by the way. But yes, it's sort of sense. Yeah. I mean, if you can try to find something like that in a shop, oh my God, they should be able to catalog their own stock by now. But yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to. I mean, you know, I've used stuff, done stuff that has undoubtedly worked. I don't talk about it in public, and I'm not going to now. But I do know it works. I have enough experience of my own to say absolutely this stuff works. How it works, why it works, I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows. I mean, you can say that it's because this reason, you can say well, it's that reason, you can say this form of magic works better than that one does, but people have used different kinds of magic to achieve the same result and have had the result they sought, even though they might have worked very differently. That's the thing. I don't think there's any one particular form of magic that works. And then you can argue, well, is there an underlying schema, if you like, of magic, a kind of a core system that you could tap into directly and not worry about some other bits and pieces. It's a funny one because I think possibly not, because I think you still need to use the correct elements that are involved, even though the core idea you're trying to achieve the same thing by different methods, which involve different things. Let's say, for example, you might be using a cauldron if you're working much more folk magic way. You might be working sort of more ceremonial with a big sigil that you're using to achieve the same results. Both achieve the result you're looking for, even though they work very differently. So is there an underlying system you could apply that would work anyway? And I don't think there would be. I think you need to have those kind of things involved. I mean, give you an example of what I mean is we all have the concept of what a car is, you know, a car, but there's no such thing as a generic car. There's a Ford, there's a Vauxhall, there's Rolls Royce. There's no generic car. You have to have one of those kind of things in order to get from A to B. You can't just have the generic car that will do everything all these cars can do. Do you see what I mean? It has to have, you have to have those elements according to whatever system you're working with, even though you're achieving the same results by different methods. There still has to be the method for it to actually work. That answers your question. I'm not sure I've answered the question there.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. Now, David he's an absolute authority of information, the same as yourself, and you could...
Oh no, Dave's way beyond what I know when it comes to grimoire magic, definitely.
Absolutely amazing, some of the information that comes out in these talks. This is why I think people should attend these kind of things. He said also that whilst he's been doing some of his work, things have happened in the room. Paranormal activity, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Why do you think there isn't more of that kind of working in the paranormal field?
I think there's a good there's two good reasons, actually. The first is, and I'll have to be brutally honest, is when I've come across paranormal groups doing this kind of stuff, they haven't a clue what they're doing. They really don't. Someone's picked up a book from the shop, they've read a few bits of it and think, I'll just give that a try. There's not the years of work and dedication to really understand what they're doing. That, I think, is a little worrying. I'll give you an example of where I think there's a good example of this, if you like. Many years ago, when I was involved with a group called Fright Nights, the original Fright Nights, we used to go a lot to a place in Nottingham called the Nottingham Jail. And it's a very large building from the Victorian age and earlier than that. And there's the court upstairs, and downstairs are a number of cells. There's a wash area, a men's wash area and a women's washing area. And they're haunted, no doubt about it. Strange things go on there. They've got an atmosphere to them, spooky, kind of ghostly, but nothing particularly sinister, shall we say. We'd been there many times, and the women's wash area always felt roughly the same. You felt it was haunted, there was energies there, but nothing too dark or sinister. On this particular Saturday we were there, the bathroom felt really strange. It didn't feel right at all. It felt very odd, and we couldn't really put a finger on it. It felt like something had happened there. We didn't know what it was, but there was just definitely a residual feeling of something that wasn't right. And I happened to, during one of the breaks, speak to the security guard who's in a little sort of room just beside the main entryway inside. And I said about anything going on in the bathroom, and he noticed anything. He said, yes, the group that were in the night before, we found the remains of candles and candle wax. They'd been up to something in that. They might have been black, actually, but certainly there were candles and candle wax had been left behind. He wasn't very happy, and they was reported to the management, and basically that group wouldn't be allowed to go back in again. So it seemed quite clear to me that they'd done something. They'd carried out some kind of ritual there, which, you know, when you're talking about dealing with magic, you can work essentially anywhere. It's got nothing to do with your location. But if you're doing paranormal investigating, surely you're investigating the location. So if you don't want to supplant something that doesn't belong there into the space, or cause really difficult vibrational effects that make things become weird and strange, like they did that night in the jar, because we know it didn't feel right. It didn't feel as supposed to. I could certainly sense something wasn't right about it at all. Having said that, there are specific spells that are designed to induce ghostly activity, but they're designed to work with what's in the area. And I think I may have mentioned before, again, one of the locations I've been to a lot, I used to do a little ritual downstairs in one part of the building, which was specifically designed to communicate, to rouse up the ghostly elements that are present there. But it was very specifically designed for that purpose. It was specifically written down to achieve that particular end. It wasn't like a general kind of summoning, because if you're summoning or invocating, you're summoning something specific that has potentially no connection to the place you're in. And if you're there on a ghost hunt, you want to be connected with the things that are in the place you're in, don't you?
Yeah.
The short answer is I generally don't think it's a good idea unless the person really does know what they're doing and what the particular aim to achieve is.
And that's the key point, isn't it? If you're going to do this work in the paranormal field, then you've really got to know what you're doing, because you've got to shut it down afterwards.
Exactly, because if you are successful and you do open up portals, I mean, I don't know the terminology we tend to use these things, but if you are causing a connection to something like that, you don't want to leave it behind. Other people have got to visit the place, got to be there. You know, that's the thing. That's the important thing, is you work sensibly, and that's where you tend to work only dedicated groups or on your own with specific intent and purposes in a very much your own space that you've created, rather than sort of occupying somebody else's. And I would say if you do a haunted location, you're potentially meddling with the energies that are present there and just causing it to upset them, and only in the sense that, you know, you cause bad vibe, if you like, not necessarily going to cause dark spirits to come and eat your brain or something, but it's causing a vibration that you don't necessarily want to occur, or the place doesn't want or doesn't feel is appropriate.
Now, quickly, because we've run out of time, but I would like to talk about Georgiev, who was there as well. Now, this is an incredibly different way of working. It's not, it's the Asian Indian cultural beliefs that George was talking about. A cacophony of sound and colour and motion goes on with their ritual work. But there was a long process of preparation before they go into the ceremony. And it's a ceremony rather than a ritual, isn't it?
Yes, it's almost part of the religious system. Essentially it was to do with tantric possession rites from Tantra in India, but it's a very specific cult that he has done a lot of research on. They're probably the more extreme form of spirit possession as far as they're concerned. It involved hours of preparation and ritual, the most amazing costumes, as we saw in the video that George accompanied his talk. It's about kind of growth of power and connecting with these, literally bringing these god forms into your being, if you like, into your very into your very essence through the costume. But it involves some quite graphic imagery. He showed one video. There was two he actually had with him, and I'm quite relieved he didn't show the second one because that actually got quite nasty in places. But ritual sort of wounding of oneself and carrying up kind of sort of piercings. And I mean, there's a classic image you sometimes see of this sort of thing of a large, like spike thing going through a person's cheek, coming out one side, going through the other cheek, and apparently not bleeding or showing any signs of physical pain. Now, again, that's absolutely real. It's documented as being real. That actually works. But it's all to do with ecstatic states of mind, and obviously for that culture, it is then connected with those sort of powerful beings like Shiva and Kali, those Hindu god forms. That gives you that ability to suffer or what looks like incredibly painful, torturous experiences without feeling any pain or producing any blood. But again, it's to do with state of mind. Again, it's mind power. It's how powerful our minds are to be able to experience this kind of real discomfort and yet be able to sort of function the moments afterwards as if nothing actually happened. You're in a particularly powerful trance state. So, I mean, it does kind of parallel what we were talking about before. It is about states of mind and how powerful our mind is, what it can achieve.
Which is absolutely fascinating. Now, he talked about sacred groves. They actually have a specific area where they go to do this, a sacred grove. Loads of uses of local, herbs and stuff goes into the rituals, painting symbols on their bodies, creating that mental state. The costumes are all made. They're not used time and time again. They're used specifically for that ritual. It's a whole village build up to this particular ritual. It used to involve human sacrifice. It doesn't now. It just goes more into the self-mutilation practices, which
that's the word for mutilation. Thank you. That was the remember.
And the main person who's focused on in regards to this ritual or this ceremony creates the ritual. Every year it's different because it's created through a dream vision. And that for me was fascinating because it's crossing so many different for them, that's part of it. That's just how they work. That's it. To us it seems bizarre, but to them it's so important that they worship and do the ceremonies for these.
It's bizarre if you think about it. You think about the Last Supper and what that involves. You talk about the Catholic, I forget the word now I'm looking for, but where basically you eat that piece of unleavened bread, which represents the body of Christ. You drink the wine, which is the blood of Christ. Is it that far removed? It is still that kind of almost sacrificial, consume me physically elements, which is in modern day Catholicism, that kind of idea. But this stuff is pretty dramatic. Having said that, I have the PowerPoint imagery from George's talk in front of me now. I just happened to click it open. And I remember one particular headdress. You remember it was like 20 feet high.
Yeah, it was enormous.
Keep it still long enough. And the elaborate costumes are being decorated into, being sort of stitched and tied into. The amazing face paint, etc., that is being used is incredible. It is all about that kind of connecting with the dangers, the fears. It is confronting fear in a sense. You've got these guys are running through, we've seen people walk over hot coals before, but these guys are running through like 10-foot high flames with these costumes on and coming out the other side unmarked. I mean, okay, we know it works because you move fast enough for it, you're not going to get burnt. You have to sort of rest in the flame for it to burn you, but it still looks spectacular. It really does look amazing.
It is, as I say, the only way I could explain it was a cacophony of sound with bells and drums and dancing, on the ground. It was like, bare-feeted dancing around bonfires and stuff like that. And when we start talking about they erect a pole, like effectively a totem pole, which you look at the sword, we talked about the sword, there are similarities going through. Although they're working very much in the traditions and the cultural of their world part, their area of where they live and their belief systems that they built up, you can see similarities between what they do over there and what is done in other areas in the world. There's a huge crossover, and you can find similarities within all kinds of working, and that's interesting in itself, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, interesting. You mentioned one little thing that's become a recurring theme. There was, of course, the use of the ritual sword. swords playing part again, which is quite fascinating indeed. The start of the little video that George showed exactly that, the sharpening of the blade. That was very much part of the ceremony, that those knives are sharpened for the ceremony, and some of the imagery that we've got here in his PowerPoint shows those ritual blades set at the side of the altar. You can see how important they are, and they look vicious as well. Some of these blades are really nasty, big curves in them. Others are like almost rectangles, they're like no point to them, just the edges are incredibly sharp and look quite nasty. But it all plays that part of, that taking almost to the edge of safety and beyond that to try and connect with these powers and connect in with these god forms that they're trying to embody in their appearance.
One thing was for sure, the self-discipline of the performer, they call it the person who's performing the ritual, I suppose you'd call it, the self-discipline and the manipulation of the physical through traditional psychology, basically, is crazy when you think about it, isn't it? It's just so fascinating when you see a completely different culture working a traditional ritual or traditional ceremony in this way. And even down to, we talked about self-mutilation and putting themselves through this, but the bloodletting, again, it's a theme that runs through so many cultures and belief systems. It's untrue. Absolutely fascinating discussion, although a little hard going for people that are not used to that kind of culture.
It's kind of one of the reasons I wanted George to speak. I wanted something that was a little different, that would leave people an impression. And from talking to people during the break afterwards, people took a lot more from his talk than I thought they were going to. I thought people might be a bit lost and confused, but no, people said, "No, it was really fascinating. That was interesting stuff." So I like the fact that it did that. It brought something that was quite different to everything else that was really going on in the day.
Very much so. I have to say for myself, when he first started talking, it was a bit like not really getting this. But as he went on, I could see those similarities and it started to make sense. And as Richard said to me, he was with me and Daryl, they said you didn't write for quite a while into the talk and then you started scribbling like mad. And I said, it's because I suddenly got it. It's because halfway through I thought, now I'm getting it. And when we talk of terms like tantric and we start talking like you mentioned Kali and Shiva, those kind of deities are well known through, again, probably modern media, those names and stuff. And then you start going, oh yeah, and things start clicking in. And that was what I found fascinating about that, because although it felt very alien when he first started talking, by the end of the talk I was thinking, I get it. I kind of don't want to do it, but I get it. You know what I mean? It's a bit too far for my liking. Not the way I would like to work, but I can understand it from their cultural perspective.
It's the power of belief, isn't it? It's the power of absolute, unquestioning belief that this is real for them. That creates that ability to do these extraordinary things. But again, as I often speak of, it is the power of the mind more than anything else. I mean, you can debate for days, weeks, years whether these things are genuinely coming from other realities, these things exist beyond us, or are part of us. As I say, I think somewhere between the two. But it's the power of the mind, even to be able to connect with this, to do this stuff, is the power of your mind. It's an important thing. It's not just that funny lump of clay thing sitting in the middle of your head. It's far more to it than that. Definitely. I know we're running out of time. I just want to very briefly say that we had an excellent time at the end with Gemma Gary and Jane Cox and Anna Raymond's band. Morvran, who performed live. It's the songs. Music is traditional, but the songs of the first part were written specifically based around one of Gemma Gary's books, which is the Devil's Dozen, which is a series of incantations and spells to the devil, which they then set to music to create the first part of the live performance. It was just the three of them, but it was the amount of sound they could produce, just three of them, was amazing. A guitar, a violin, vocals and drums. It was brilliant. Second part was a lot of real traditional Cornish folklore music, which they perform as well. And it was the first time they'd performed live as a group in front of any audience, so it was a great privilege of ours to be their first performance ever, and everyone seemed to enjoy themselves and they thoroughly enjoyed the performance, so that was really good. And they are just to finish off, signed up for the next conference, which I can officially tell you for definite will be spring 2021. We are taking a break next year because it's an awful lot of work and I could do with a bit of a rest from it, but we will definitely be back in 2021, and we thought we'd go for spring this time rather than winter, partly because it's only 18 months rather than 2 years away, and two, I think it's nice to do it differently. As I say, there's one of the reasons we did our conference sort of September time last time was there wasn't a lot around, and then suddenly a lot more things were happening. But hopefully we're looking at early spring 2021, maybe sort of March time, when again it looks relatively quiet. So we're offering something that would be available which isn't clashing too much with anything else that's going on. So I wanted to rush that a little bit in because we're running out of time.
No, that's absolutely fine, because that's one of the questions I was going to say. It's definitely coming back. I would recommend anybody that is interested in this kind of working to attend. The information that's given is absolutely phenomenal. People that have researched this and work in this way, authorities in their own right. It's absolutely fascinating, and it keeps my interest every single time, and I will be attending the next one as well. I can guarantee that one. Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining me again tonight to talk to me about this, because it's a subject that's very close to my heart. I thoroughly enjoy talking to you, and you're a wealth of information in your own right.
I'll do what I can.
So come back again, I'm sure.
Yes, I mean, just very briefly, my next book for Three Hands Press is now complete and should be out spring next year on the Citra Arca, which is a bit complicated. But my other book I'm working on at the moment is my Rune book, which is I'm basically rewriting, which should be out in the spring, with Troy Books, which again is a bit of an announcement there. It's to come out through Troy Books in the spring. So maybe I can come back and talk about that.
Fantastic. That sounds absolutely brilliant. I can't wait to talk to you about that. Now, what have we got next coming up on Parasearch Radio for you? Tomorrow evening, Wednesday, 9 p.m, Haunted Histories. Penny is talking about the underground German hospital. That one sounds absolutely fascinating. Can't wait to hear all about that one. And on Thursday evening, PSH Radio, Carl and Sam are joined in the studio by the fantastically named Linda and Victor Salazar. Love that name. It's absolutely brilliant. And then that will be the end of it for this week for Parasearch Radio. But don't forget, on Monday, you can join me live in the Parasearch Radio group page to listen to all the up-and-coming shows that are going on Parasearch throughout your December listening. On that note, thank you again, Andy. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
I look forward to it too.
And we bid you a very farewell and a good night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.